Good morning and welcome to the Joint Money Committee's meeting. I am Senator Janet Howell, Chair of the Senate Finance and Appropriations Committee. Today I'll be chairing this meeting along with Chair Luke Torian of the House Appropriations Committee and Chair Vivian Watts of the House Finance Committee. Also joining us are members of the three money committees. The purpose of today's meeting is to receive the governor's proposal for amendments to the 2020-2022 biennial budget. Shortly, we will hear from His Excellency the Governor. After his presentation, the clerk will call the roll of all committee members in attendance. This will be followed by a presentation on the revenue outlook by the Secretary of Finance, Aubrey Lane. We will then conclude with a presentation by Dan Timberlake, the Director of the Department of Planning and Budget. Ordinarily, at this point, we would stand and give a rousing applause to His Excellency the Governor. Unfortunately, that isn't possible right now, Governor, but please know that we give you our warmest regards and are eager to hear what you have to say.
Well, good morning, and Chairman Howe, Chairman Torian, Chairwoman Watts, Speaker Fillicorn, and members of the General Assembly, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for the privilege of speaking with you this morning. I would like to recognize Lieutenant Governor Justin Fairfax and our Attorney General Mark Herring, also my wife Pam, who is with us this morning, and members of our cabinet and staff. We'd certainly rather be meeting in person today, but it is much safer to meet this way as the COVID-19 pandemic starts its 10th month and cases are rising. And before we turn to today's business and discuss our budget proposals, I'd like to give a short update on the pandemic. Throughout the long months of this health crisis, Virginia has done comparatively well. Our efforts to bend the curve early on worked, and the virus spread through our Commonwealth slowly, for the most part, has been slow for the last 10 months. Unfortunately, the spread is increasing around the country and here in Virginia too. Our percent positivity has doubled in the past month, as have our daily new cases. More people are being hospitalized, and unfortunately, more are dying. 38 additional deaths today. Virginia is still doing better than about 45 other states on a per capita basis. But this virus is spreading fast, and we all need to continue to be as careful as possible. Please wear a mask, avoid social gatherings, stay 6 feet away from others, and wash your hands. Vaccines are now being deployed in Virginia. Healthcare workers got their first shots yesterday. And while it will take months to vaccinate everyone, we can now start to look to the future with hope. We're all tired, but this is not the time to let down your guard or to be reckless. We have crafted this budget against the backdrop of this pandemic. The plan I will present to you today is intended to help Virginians navigate the next phase of the crisis and perhaps its final months. It will position us to recover as quickly as possible as we rebuild our economy in a post-pandemic world. And it's about advancing the progressive agenda that we all embarked upon together just a year ago. Now, if it feels like we just did this budget exercise, well, we did. In August, I called the General Assembly into special session to deal with the pandemic's effects on our revenues and budget. The budget I proposed then focused on preserving liquidity to deliver services and pay our bills. It ensured that we did not destabilize our financial footing by using one-time money to pay for recurring expenses. It preserved financial options because we cannot predict the future, especially during this pandemic. It made targeted investments to help Virginia through the crisis. And it restored funding for priorities that will make Virginia stronger, such as investments in historically Black colleges and universities, and African American historical and cultural sites, stable and affordable housing, broadband access, and reforms to modernize our criminal justice system. I thank you for your diligent work, returning to me a budget that aligned with our shared priorities. I was pleased to sign that budget just over a month ago. The budget that I present today preserves our focus on flexibility, targeted investments, and help for our fellow Virginians. While we believe an end to this crisis and a rebounding of our economy is in sight, we're not there yet. We must continue to make choices that help Virginians get through these times. You will see investments in vaccination, affordable housing, skills training, and early childhood education, for example. We have put a special focus on the second year of the budget, which starts next July. By then, we hope most Virginians will be vaccinated, and our society and our economy will have begun returning to more normal activities. Helping support this recovery takes investment and planning as well, and you will see that in this budget. When we crafted the last budget in August, our team of outside economic advisors had met and agreed on a new economic forecast for Virginia. It was recessionary. While Virginia's revenues did not take as great a hit from the pandemic as we expected early in the year, we did see a slowing economy and revenue losses, and that was expected to continue. That same team of advisors met again last month to revise the forecast again in light of current conditions. Our economic picture is now more stable, and we can expect more revenue over the coming year and a half than was predicted back in August. And this is good news for Virginia. Based on the expert advice of economists and business leaders, our team now estimates $1.2 billion in additional revenue in this biennium. We all need to understand how important this is. Revenues are exceeding official forecasts, even during this pandemic. This is in sharp contrast to other states. Other states have laid off workers, cut services, and even borrowed money to pay their bills, actions that will weaken their financial pictures for years to come. But here in Virginia, our finances are solid, and the actions we have taken have kept our AAA bond rating secure. We are one of only 13 states that hold this rating, and it's because we laid out a long-term financial plan and we have stuck to it in good times and bad. We must continue this work. These additional revenues are what allow us to help Virginians who need it and prepare for a recovery. You'll see throughout this budget that our spending decisions are focused on supporting people now and building foundations for the future. Part of that foundation is a healthy reserve fund. That is why I'm allocating $650 million to our reserves. This level of reserve funding will get us to the goal of having 8% in reserves by the end of my term. This is more than any previous governor of either party. It's important to note that these are dollars we had previously earmarked for reserves then unallotted. They come from one-time cash balances, which is why they should not be used to pay for ongoing programs. Instead, putting them in reserves makes sure they're accessible if revenues don't go as quickly as expected, so we won't have to make budget cuts. While we expect to turn a corner on this pandemic in the coming months, if there is anything that we have learned this year, it is to prepare for the unexpected. Putting these revenues in reserves gives us that flexibility. It's important that we don't promise one-time resources for ongoing spending. That's why we're using $100 million to reduce unfunded liabilities in the Virginia retirement system. This one-time investment will focus on the retirement plan for public school teachers, the state employee health insurance credit program, and benefits for our first responders. This is sound fiscal policy that will keep VRS on a more solid footing, and importantly, it means our public servants can feel more secure about their future benefits. For thousands of Virginians, the pandemic has meant lost jobs, lost income, and serious financial struggle. Our administration has worked throughout this pandemic to help those folks who need it the most. We have distributed $3.1 billion in Federal CARES Act funding, helping individuals, businesses, healthcare providers, and local governments around our Commonwealth. That includes $1.3 billion to our localities, who have used it for innovative responses to the crisis. We've seen small business support programs, hazard pay for health and public safety workers, technology investments, and 1,000 other ways to help Virginians navigate this pandemic. I am hopeful that Congress will act soon to pass new legislation to provide additional assistance. We took steps to make it as easy as we could to apply for unemployment, upgrading a system that was a generation old. We worked to put a moratorium on evictions and foreclosures for those having trouble paying their rent or mortgage. We have dispersed more than $40 million in Federal CARES Act funding to the Rent and Mortgage Relief Program to help more than 13,000 households. And we have earmarked $100 million to help people having trouble paying their utility bills during this crisis. We know that just as individuals and families are struggling, so are our small businesses. We distributed nearly $100 million to help 2,500 small businesses across our Commonwealth survive. While programs to help people with rent and utility payments continue, it's also important to look ahead and help unemployed Virginians get back on their feet, and to continue helping those who are struggling to keep a roof over their heads. This budget devotes $25 million to maintaining our historic investment in the Housing Trust Fund. This builds on the $85 million we put into that fund this biennium, an unprecedented investment in helping make sure people have stable housing. As we invest in Virginians, we want to help those who are struggling get back on their feet. That's why this budget partially restores funding for the G3 program, which we unallotted in April from the original budget. G3, get a skill, get a job, and give back, is a program I have championed since before I became governor. It helps people get job skill training in high-need fields through our community colleges. Even more importantly, it provides the financial aid necessary to help people get that training. G3 will provide free community college for certain low and middle-income Virginians who enroll at our two-year colleges in pathways that lead to a high-demand job. These pathways include the skilled trades, healthcare, technology, early childhood, and public safety. For those folks who have seen their jobs disappear during this pandemic, G3 could be a lifeline. That's why I have prioritized this important investment. That is also why we're allocating $30 million to restore financial aid increases at public colleges and universities across our Commonwealth. We had proposed these increases last winter, but unallotted them. We're also restoring our plan to increase tuition assistance grants for students at private institutions to $4,000. For Virginia State University and Norfolk State University, our public historically black colleges and universities, which have long been underfunded, we're proposing additional assistance to help support student access and success. While it is wonderful to open the newspaper this morning and see news of major philanthropic gifts to VSU and other HBCUs, this is in addition to, not in place of, state support that is still very necessary. And for George Mason University and Old Dominion University, we're restoring funding to address enrollment disparities, increases in transfer students, and support educational program development. I want to thank the General Assembly for working with us to ensure that some of our CARES Act funding has gone to ensure people whose jobs have been impacted by the pandemic can get the training and credentials that they need. I have also maintained our historic level of funding for broadband in this budget, $50 million in each year. For G3 to work, for our students to access virtual classrooms, for businesses to survive, for Virginians to access telehealth, they need broadband internet. It is as critical now as electricity was in the last century. Increasing broadband access has been a priority since I took office, and the pandemic has simply highlighted how necessary it is. Now I'd like to turn to our public schools. Of all the services administered by state and local governments, our schools have been the most disrupted by this pandemic. Early in the spring, schools quickly shifted to a virtual format. School divisions across Virginia have spent this fall working to balance learning with safety, trying to find the right combination of in-person, virtual, or hybrid learning. Often the way children attend school has changed week by week as local school boards and divisions respond to the evolving health situation in their local communities. I know that this has been hard on every student, every teacher, every parent, and every school administrator in Virginia. I continue to be impressed with how school staff, students, and families have literally risen to meet these challenges. As families have faced decisions about the best way to safely educate their child, school divisions have seen some drops in enrollment. We understand that every family must do what's best for their children. We also expect enrollment numbers to rebound once the pandemic has subsided and in-person learning becomes the norm again. While these enrollment declines normally would result in less state funding, that would devastate our public education system. That is why this budget helps school divisions, students, and teachers. This budget accounts for the reduction in enrollment, but also protects school divisions with funding to ensure they don't suffer from any loss of funding under the enrollment formulas that drive the allocation of state dollars. We're budgeting more than $500 million over 2 years to help schools weather this temporary decrease. I also know that the challenging nature of this school year is hitting students especially hard. It is not easy for children to be separated from their friends or to miss the school activities that they enjoy. I believe our students need help now more than ever. That is why I'm providing $26.6 million in this budget to increase the number of our school counselors. We have pushed for more school counselors for a long time, and this will ensure we have one full-time school counselor for every 325 students. So let's get it done. The mental health of our students is too important to wait for another budget year. So is the education of our littlest learners. This budget restores funding for early education, including a pilot program to provide 3-year-olds access to early childhood education programs and grants to address pay equity issues for early childhood educators. Early childhood education has been a priority for me since I was in medical school. The majority of brain development occurs in these early years. We want every child to enter kindergarten ready to learn. Our teachers have gone above and beyond this year, adapting to new ways of connecting with their students while protecting their own health and that of their families. My budget provides a 2% bonus for instructional and support positions. That is consistent with budget language from the General Assembly that says when our revenues get better, our teachers deserve to be rewarded, a goal that we all share. We have worked for a long time to raise teacher pay. We were all proud in 2018 to give our teachers the largest single-year pay raise in 15 years. And last year, I proposed adding a 3% pay raise on top of that. While we had to unallot the money for that raise, teachers deserve it. So if we see our revenues improve, as we expect next month, I'll push to change this one-time bonus into a permanent pay raise of at least 2%. It is just a small way to say thank you for your devotion to educating our children. The budget also includes a bonus for state employees, adjunct faculty, and state-supported local employees. That includes local mental health workers and social workers, some state-supported law enforcement officers, and others. Workers in every government agency have had to adapt to changes this year. For some, it meant working from home. For others, like our DMV workers, it has meant plexiglass barriers, masks in the office, and other new challenges. This is one simple way to, again, say thank you. I am truly grateful for every public servant in Virginia's workforce, but our elections officials have had a particularly grueling year. They had multiple elections during a pandemic, and they did it successfully and smoothly, and I am grateful to them. It is time to update our state voter registration system, a system that benefits everyone no matter who you vote for. In a world where we have to worry about cyber attacks and bad actors, this is an investment in security so we stay ahead of them. I have included $16.7 million for this. We are all heartened by the news of vaccinations that are starting to be put into arms as we speak. This is the light at the end of a very long and dark tunnel. Vaccines are the only way we can end this pandemic and get back to a more normal life. But to do that, we must vaccinate millions of Virginians. That's a lot of shots and a lot of arms. It will take a great deal of time, effort, and money. That money should come from the federal government, but we've all learned not to wait. So in this budget, I have provided $90 million to support this vaccination effort and ensure we have the supplies, the staffing, and other infrastructures needed to vaccinate 8 million Virginians. The Virginia Department of Health has been planning for this mass vaccination effort for months, and they have hit the ground running as vaccine doses were shipped into the Commonwealth just this week. We don't always pay as much attention as we should to our public health departments and the vital work that they do. Under Virginia's system, both the state and local governments have a role in operating our health departments. But the formula we use to determine how much the state pays for those local health departments hasn't been updated in a generation. Years in which Virginia has changed from a rural state to an urban and suburban one. With this formula frozen in time, places that have seen their economies change, like Lee and Wise counties in the coal fields, or cities like Petersburg and Richmond, are stuck paying more than they should. Updating the formula is an equity issue, and we're going to get it done this year. We'll also make sure that no local health department gets less funding as a result. And while the pandemic is the greatest public health crisis we have faced in modern times, we know that every day Virginians face personal health issues, and sometimes public policy can help them live healthier lives. For example, maternal and neonatal mortality rates have changed little since 2004, and we also have seen an alarming racial disparity. Black mothers are more than twice as likely to die from complications from pregnancy as other mothers are. Countless advocates have said if you want to improve maternal health, expand the services you cover for pregnant women and new mothers. You should cover services by doulas. Doulas provide non-clinical support to pregnant women through their pregnancy and after they give birth. And multiple studies show they improve health outcomes for the mother and the baby. For that reason, this budget provides $2.4 million for doula services for pregnant women. We're also providing $4 million over 2 years to expand access to long-acting reversible contraceptives. LARCs help women be in control of their own reproductive decisions, and that is a good thing. This budget also lays the groundwork to legalize marijuana in our Commonwealth. We know that laws to ban marijuana historically were based in discrimination, and criminalization laws have disproportionately harmed minority communities. Virginia has studied the experience of other states, including taxation, banking, criminal justice, licensing, and regulation. Our path forward will lead with social equity, public health, and public safety. This session is the time to get this done. Reforming our marijuana laws is one way to ensure that Virginia is a more just state that works better for everyone. It also will eventually bring in tax revenue that can be used to further make sure we are providing equitable access to opportunity. For example, just half of the potential annual revenue could pay for 2 years of quality pre-K to every one of Virginia's most vulnerable 3- and 4-year-olds, children who deserve the best start in life. As we consider ways to make our criminal justice system more fair and equitable, we must talk about improving our system of expunging past crimes from people's records. I have put $20 million into this budget so it will be ready when we conclude the important discussion of how best to conduct expungements. Like marijuana legalization, this is a priority that needs action in this session. This is an important step toward modernizing our criminal justice system. We are also proposing to add 4 judges to Virginia's Court of Appeals, along with support staff, to ensure the court can hear more appeals cases in a timely manner under an increasing workload. 2020 has been a landmark year. Not only has the pandemic upended our lives and our society, we have seen mass protests against racial injustice. These protests have sparked change, both in our systems and in our symbols. We use statues and monuments as symbols to tell the story of who we are as a people. But for too long, our monuments have told only part of the story. Monuments to the Confederacy are legacies of a lost cause mentality that has burdened Virginia for far too many years. This year, finally, these monuments are coming down. This budget includes funding to install a new statue to represent Virginia in our U.S. Capitol. Already, a commission has voted to replace the current statue, and they will soon propose a replacement that reflects what Virginia is today. This is difficult work, and it must be guided by trusted voices that the community respects. I have provided almost $11 million to help the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, working with the City of Richmond, lead the work to redefine the public art of Richmond's Monument Avenue, now that 7 of the 8 Confederate statues have been removed and the last one will come down soon. The VMFA is one of the world's leading museums and is an ideal partner in this work. Monuments and statues are not the only ways we tell the story of who we are. Cultural and historical sites are an important and meaningful part of our complicated past. Right here in Richmond, efforts have been underway for some time to preserve the site known as the Devil's Half Acre, or Lumpkin's Jail in Shockoe Bottom. It was part of a notorious market selling enslaved human beings. Our budget includes $9 million for preservation work and to help turn it into the slavery heritage site. I've also included funding to help restore and return headstones from Columbian Harmony Cemetery. It was an historic African-American burial ground in the District of Columbia. People buried there included two sons of abolitionist Frederick Douglass, Elizabeth Keckley, confidant of Mary Todd Lincoln, Philip Reed, who helped create the Statue of Freedom atop the U.S. Capitol Dome, many Black Union Army veterans, and one of D.C.'s first Black policemen. In the 1960s, the cemetery was moved to make way for commercial development. The stones were sold. To dump their grave markers or sell them for scrap stone is just dehumanizing, and that was part of the goal. Some of them found their way across the Potomac to our shores right here in Virginia. Now that those headstones are on Virginia's land, it's our duty to help get them back to the graves they were meant to mark. We have worked with the descendant community as well as D.C. Mayor Bowser and Maryland Governor Hogan to make this happen. Our budget includes $5 million for this project. Along with these investments in historic resources, we're restoring funding for targeted environmental protection and sustainability. The last time I was in New York City to meet with our bond rating agencies, they all asked me the same question. What is our plan for climate resilience? How, they asked, is Virginia preparing for the very real problem of climate change? We have made a number of investments in our administration to increase coastal resilience. To build on those, in this budget we are restoring nearly $12 million for water quality, air quality, and land conservation initiatives at natural resource agencies. This includes DEQ staffing to make sure that the permitting process moves along more quickly. These are important investments to ensure that we don't fall behind in protecting these critical assets. We're also targeting $1 million to develop a hardwood forest habitat program that will encourage landowners to regenerate hardwood trees and support the watershed improvement program. These investments in agriculture sustainability will reap benefits long into our future. The pandemic has limited our ability and desire to travel the way we used to. We all know, for now, it is safer to stay at home. But as we look past the pandemic, our roads and our railroads still need investment. It's an important priority to ensure that people and goods can move easily and efficiently around our Commonwealth. That's why this budget invests $50 million in our Rail to Roanoke initiative, providing the Department of Rail and Public Transportation the resources needed to buy right-of-way to help make this project happen. This is an important down payment on extending passenger rail connections in Southwest Virginia. The pandemic has shown us that much work can be done from anywhere, but that means transportation access is more important than ever. Already, we have folks who work in Northern Virginia or D.C., live and work remotely in Fredericksburg or Richmond, and just take the train north when they need to visit the office. There's no reason people can't also do that from Roanoke and beyond. We just have to make it happen. Together with the planned expansion of the Long Bridge over the Potomac River from Virginia into D.C., This will make rail travel across our Commonwealth easier, and it will ensure that Southwest Virginia shares in the greater flexibility these connections will bring. The pandemic has taught us to prepare for the unexpected and help people get through this crisis. That is what this budget does. It provides targeted support to help people and lays a foundation for recovery as we move into the next phases of the pandemic. When we started this year, we could never have predicted what was in store. It has been one of the most difficult years of many of our lives. But I am proud of how Virginia has handled the crisis of this year. When it became clear the pandemic was not going to end in 2 weeks or a month, we acted quickly to freeze all state hiring and discretionary spending. That saved more than $350 million for Virginia. We worked with you in the legislature to set aside the historic investments in Virginia's future we had planned so we could have maximum flexibility in our budget. Our revenues dipped, but not as much as we feared. We came together this fall to focus our state resources on helping Virginians get through this crisis. And now we look forward to an eventual end for this pandemic and the hard but welcome work of getting Virginia's economy back on its feet. As we wrote this budget, our decisions were driven by one question: how much will this help Virginians? We will reach the other side of this pandemic, and I am confident that this budget will help us get through this and rebound more quickly. I look forward to working with you all in the upcoming General Assembly session to ensure we provide Virginians the help they need and invest in their future. I'd like to end, if I could, with a thank you. For months now, Virginians in all corners of this state have been doing the right thing. Of course, there are some folks whose antics grab the headlines. But please hear this. Most people, most Virginians, they just want to live their lives. They want to keep themselves and their loved ones healthy. They want their kids to do well in school. They want good jobs to put food on their tables and a roof over their head. They want their communities to be safe and healthy as well. And we've seen so many people taking care of each other, from our nurses and doctors to our teachers, our grocery store workers, the bus drivers, to every Virginian who pulls that mask out of their pocket and puts it on before they go into the store. Virginians care about each other. That has been a bright light in a dark year. And I am grateful every day for the people of this great Commonwealth. Thank you. May God bless all of you, and may all of you have a happy and peaceful holiday season. Thank you.
Presenting your budget. You've given us a very strong document with important priorities to work off of, and we're very appreciative of your efforts.
Thank you.
At this point, I believe we will have a roll call.
Thank you, Madam Chair Howell. I will start with House Appropriations, followed by House Finance and House Research. I will then call the members of the Finance and Appropriations. When I call your name, please respond to two or less. Chairman Corden. Present. Delegate. Present. Delegate Plum. Present. Delegate Tyler. Present. Delegate Silva. Present. Delegate McQueen. Delegate McQuinn. Present.
Present.
Delegate Austin.
Here.
Delegate Blossom.
Here.
Delegate Rule.
Present.
Madam Chair Watts.
Present.
Delegate King.
Present.
Delegate Corey. Delegate Corey. Delegate Sullivan.
Here.
Delegate Murphy.
Here.
Murphy's here.
Delegate Heretic.
Here.
Delegate Ayala.
Here.
Delegate Carter. Delegate Carter. Delegate Mugler.
Here.
Delegate Hudson.
Here.
Delegate Scott. Delegate Scott. Delegate Willett. Delegate Willett. Delegate Orrock.
Present.
Delegate Byron.
Present.
Delegate Ware. Delegate Ware. Delegate Wright. Delegate Wright. Delegate Gilbert.
Here.
Delegate
that was-
Dexter.
Hold on. Delegate Gilbert is here. I think Delegate Wright just said he was here also.
Got it. Delegate Wright.
Present.
Thank you. Delegate Poindexter.
Here.
Delegate Fowler.
Here.
Delegate McNamara.
Present.
Delegate Campbell of Rockridge.
Here.
Madam Speaker Philicorn.
Present.
House Majority Leader Herring.
Present.
Madam Chair Howell.
Here.
Senator Saslaw. Senator Saslaw. Senator Normick. Senator Normick. Senator Hanger.
Here.
Senator Lucas.
Here.
Senator Newman.
Here.
Senator
Here.
Ruff. Senator Ruff.
Here.
Senator Vogel. Senator Vogel. Senator Barker.
Here.
Senator Edwards.
Here.
Senator Deeds.
Here.
Senator Locke.
Here.
Senator Peterson.
Here.
Senator Marsden.
Here.
Senator Eben.
Here.
Senator McClellan.
Here.
Madam Chair, this completes the roll call.
Thank you so much.
Excuse me, this is Delegate Kay Corey. I am here.
Yes, ma'am. I've got you.
This is Delegate Fires, and I am here.
I'm sorry, Delegate.
Delegate Fires,
Yes, sir.
House
Thank-
Appropriations.
Gotcha. Thank you very much.
Anyone else? Okay, well then at this time, I'd like to ask Secretary Lane to proceed with his presentation on our revenue outlook. And let's hold questions until the end of his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll try to add some details behind the governor's speech here. what I plan to do today is to take you through where we currently stand and the basis for the revised forecast, which the governor has included in his budget. Since the very beginning, we've taken a very measured approach to responding to this pandemic fiscally and making sure that we had good data before we revised the forecast, some of the things the governor mentioned. And as he pointed out, we are an outlier in our fiscal performance in that. And I think that goes to several factors, the mix of our economy, certainly the actions the government administration working with the General Assembly have taken, and also, to be quite frank with you, probably a little bit of luck, but most things I know that have turned out well have had a little bit of luck with it. That's allowed us to have no cutbacks, as the governor has talked about, in terms of both our localities and our school systems. We've had no cutbacks in state aid to those, no cutbacks in employees responding to the pandemic. And obviously, that has been very, very helpful as we get through this. We know the ultimate end of this will be when public confidence is back in the marketplace, where they can return back to normal lives. And the governor mentioned with the vaccine, we're getting closer, but we're not there yet. So we need to continue to take this measured approach, and I hope to go through how we arrived at that as we go through these next few slides. Now, just to take everybody back to where we were at the end of June 30th, we did end the last fiscal year down about $230 million, although that is substantially better than what we thought was going to happen. A lot of that had to do, again, with the mix of the economy, but also, I think, with the decisions we made fiscally not to move some of our tax deadlines. And that set us up, I believe, for the continued employment that we've seen, and not having to make significant drastic reductions or increases in the budget based on just timing. I'll also point out, as we get a little bit further, the federal government did move their deadline to July 15th, and actually Virginia received some $200 million in the current fiscal year that, if we go back and look at it, really related to the prior fiscal year, and we matched those to income tax returns. So we know they did relate to the 2019 tax return. So that's just something to keep in mind as we go forward here. This forecast just points out how we did to the budget. I'll point out here that we were slightly behind in withholding and sales taxes. These two revenue sources make up about 80% of our revenues, and they will form a big basis of the forecast as we move forward. In fact, as you recall, when the governor called you back for the interim forecast, this resulted in about $2.7 billion being removed from the budget that was passed back in March, and it mostly related to the activity that we had incurred over these few months from March through June. So that was a big input in how we got to the interim forecast that we're now using. Now, to talk a little bit about where the economy is today, certainly we saw in the period from July, August, and September a fairly significant rebound, both in the nation and in Virginia, a rebound in economic activity, being up over 33%. I'll remind you, we were down about 34% as a nation in the months of April, May, and June. And so if you just have simple math, if you had $100 and you lost 34%, and then you only had $64 and or $66, and then you added 33% to it, you still are not back to where the economy was before all this started. But at least we did have a fairly good rebound. Now, one thing to point out, though, as you look at the next point on here about employed people across the country, September we saw 711,000 people re-enter the workforce. That was followed by October, 610,000, and then in November by 245,000. So we have seen a slowdown in the recovery. A lot of that has to do with the increase in infections that we're seeing across the country, but also it has to do with businesses now understanding the new environment they're in, at least for the next probably 6 to 8 months, and adjusting to that. Initial claims for unemployment did increase for the most recent week, December 5th. So we are seeing some of the gains that we did get with that snapback as the virus sort of ebbed a little bit in those warmer months, sort of giving a little bit of back that now. So that all plays into public confidence as we move forward and their economic activity. Now, certainly we were bolstered in that second quarter, that is the April, May, June period, by federal policy, both monetary and fiscal policy. And I will remind the members here that as of today, most of those programs are set to expire. Certainly the CARES funding that we have been able to use has to be employed by December 30th. And also many of the large monetary programs of the Fed also end at the end of this year. It has been 6 or 7 months since we've had another stimulus package. Don't know if the one is going to be coming forward anytime soon. However, I would point out that this did underpin some of the economic activity that was going on in the months of this third quarter, which are July, August, and September out there. So if we do get another spending infusion, whether it's directly to the states or to individuals and businesses across the nation from the feds, that could end up, again, helping underpin some of this growth that we are seeing. If you look here in Virginia, we responded about the same as the nation did, although we did not have nearly the decrease in economic activity that the nation saw when you add all the states together. However, we still have about 165,000 jobs that are lost this year that people were employed last year. They are mainly in the leisure and hospitality areas, and some in the education and health, particularly in those custodial and other jobs, since many of our students are now meeting virtually. So we still have a ways to go to pull out of this, although we do have seen certainly a rebound, a fairly good rebound from the bottom. Last thing I'll point out on this slide is the Federal Reserve has continued to leave interest rates near zero. I'll come back to this later. That should and could alter the way we look and evaluate liability funding in the future. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. Now, this brings us to where our receipts are through November, so through the first 5 months of this year. We are trending about 6%, a little over 6% ahead of last year, which is significantly ahead of this interim forecast of being down about 1.8%. If you looked at this in dollar terms, that's a little over $600 million in the bank ahead of the forecast that we adopted just back in August based on the factors that were given to us based on how the economy was responding. This is important because this performance has helped shape some of the basis of the new forecast that the governor has included in his budget. So just wanted to point out we have remained fairly strong, and November, while not being a significant month, still was a positive month to the previous year. Now, when we start, this again has set the basis for the new forecast. As you know, this is just not something that the administration comes up with. There are economists from around the state and some out of the state. There are business council members from around the state. Some of them have multinational businesses that function out of the state as well. Many of the members on this call are on these committees. And after going through this robust discussion, most of the members agreed to the standard forecast, that is, the forecast that was recommended, which is a fairly significant increase from where we were just a few months ago based on the economic activity that has been occurring both in the nation and here in the Commonwealth. So as you look at the national data that went into this forecast, and I've looked at here, a lot of this has to do with better than expected news on the vaccine. The vaccine has come online a little sooner than most economists thought just a few months ago. And if we do get a federal fiscal stimulus coming out, that could boost the first quarter to help in terms of looking at it from a national perspective. But if you look at the October standard, which is the new forecast, to the inputs that we used in our interim forecast, you can see in the year 21, we're not expecting to go down as much in terms of gross domestic product and employment. But then again, when we get to the second year, we're not going to go up as much. And quite frankly, that's because we didn't have quite as low or quite as much a dip as we anticipated. Personal income is interesting because it actually is up this year. And a lot of that has to do with the transfer payments, the unemployment payments made from the federal stimulus and the stimulus checks. So that is not anticipated to happen in the coming year, although we'll see exactly what Congress puts in place. But that is why personal income held up, because of those transfer payments on a national level. Now, when you look at key Virginia statistics, and I want to put down, again, just explain this chart. The interim, the June interim, is the current forecast. The October standard is the forecast that the governor has put in his budget, and I'll get to the dollar figures in a minute. But we're experiencing a lot same in terms of relative economic activity as the nation. You can look at employment. We're not going to go down as much as we thought we were going to go down. We anticipated being down 2%. We're going to be a little less than even. But however, we won't grow as much in next year also as we look going forward. And that same statistic holds true if you look at wages and personal income. We have performed better, but don't expect in all those categories to actually do better in the next year because we didn't go down as far. So when you compare Virginia to our forecast to the nation's forecast, again, we go back to about the same relativity as we've seen in the past. And this is that when Virginia is in times of distressed economic times, we don't go down as much as the rest of the nation. A lot of that has to do with our reliance on the federal government. We're sheltered because of our defense contracting and the many employees that the federal government employs here in Virginia. Consequently, also, when things turn up, we don't go up as fast. And as you can see, employment, we're not going to go down nearly as much as the nation, but next year we probably won't grow as quickly. And that is true with wages and salaries as we go out also. So the good news is in this forecast is that we didn't go down as much as we thought. However, we're probably not going to grow as much as we thought in the second year of the biennium, but that doesn't necessarily mean we won't have more revenues because our base is actually higher because we did not go down as much as we thought. And that is explained on this chart. This is for the current year that we're in, fiscal year 21. The interim numbers on the left of the screen are the current forecast. The December numbers, now that it's been introduced by the governor, it's called the December forecast. It used, in the previous slide, it was called the October standard, but since the governor introduced it, it's now the December forecast. And you can see, bottom line there, we're expecting about $685 million more dollars in this year than the interim forecast. Primarily, that is made up of increases in sales taxes, in corporate income taxes, and wills and recordation fees. We didn't have a significant increase in net individual, and a lot of that has to do because our forecast was built on a slow, gradual increase of employment continuing throughout the rest of the quarter and the rest of this fiscal year. And we are going up against some pretty good numbers as we go out, and I'll explain that as we go out further. So, but we are going to pick up some monies in the forecast related to sales and these other items. If you look at the second year of the biennium, we're projecting to pick up about $573 million, and these numbers I'm quoting include transfers. And as you can see, excuse me, A lot of that, again, is in sales tax and corporate income taxes and wills and recordation. The withholding and net individual numbers that we had in the interim look like they're a pretty good forecast. So that's about 60% of our revenues. It looks like we've got those pretty well forecasted, even in the interim forecast, although we will pick up a little bit with the December new forecast going forward. Now, one of the things that we don't normally look at, but our forecast and economists did perform, a look at the 2 years after this biennium is over with. And this is going to be important to something that Dan Timberlake's going to go through in structural balance. In other words, what are we looking at going forward with continuing revenues? And I only put this slide in here to let you know that we are continuing to see growth in these out years. Now, certainly the further we get out, the less reliable it is, but we are still looking at 2 to 3% growth based on this forecast, the best information that we have available to us. Obviously, if we get a vaccine that's extremely successful and we get most of the Virginia and national citizens vaccinated, this could be increased more. But it looks like we are in a period of sustainable increase in revenues as we look past the biennium. And this is important to keep in mind as we think about this budget and where it ends going into the next biennium. And I'll come back to that in a little bit later. Now, so when you add all this up, this slide here depicts how the components of the new forecast. So you can see it's mainly the base revenue forecast that came out of the Gaker and the advisory meetings of our economists and our business people across the state. I will point out that in their retreats, both the House Appropriations and Senate Finance and Appropriation estimated a little bit more than we did in this forecast. And I'll come to that in a little bit because we're going to take a look at this again back in January. But we felt, based on the input that we got from all the businesses across the Commonwealth, the majority of them suggested they felt comfortable with this forecast. So may have a little bit of upward bias from that also. I also want to point out to you that this forecast is based on the current tax policy we have in place. The only adjustment we've made to this is the CARES Act. We would conform to the individual provisions of the CARES Act, but we would not conform the governor's revenue forecast to the business provisions of the CARES Act. That is roughly about $665 million in revenue lost, and we have a history of not conforming to these large revenue losses as in our past. Primarily, this would allow businesses to go back multiple years, not just the year of the pandemic, but multiple years to get taxes repaid. And quite frankly, it would favor many of the larger companies in the Commonwealth who, quite frankly, are doing pretty well during this economic downturn. And I've explained this before in other meetings. Many of those who can telework, our tech companies, our essential workers have actually added employees during this period of time. So I want to just point out here, it's the current tax policy that we do have in place. Now, I'll make one other comment. In addition to the CARES Act for individuals, we would conform to the CARES Act for PPP loans, meaning that they are forgiven, they would not be taxed in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Now, conversely, if you've gotten that revenue forgiven, you're not allowed to take those deductions either, and that's the way the federal law works, so we would conform to that. But the current tax structure on piece limitations and our deconformity to the SALT deduction, allowing people to take more than $10,000, are inherent in this policy. So I just wanted to make sure that particularly, I know Delegate Watts, just to make sure you understand the basis of the governor's forecast. Now, when you look at that, where we stand year to date, and this is the last slide I'll show you on the interim forecast, as I mentioned before, we were running about $638 million ahead of this interim forecast. And you can see a lot of that had to do with sales taxes. We thought we were going to lose almost 10%. and we're running 7% up. Same with corporate taxes, same with recordation. So clear to us that the interim forecast could be adjusted. And when you compare it now to the new December forecast, that is the one introduced in the governor's budget, we still are running about $395 million ahead of that forecast. Now, that means we did not book all the cash in bank that we could have in terms of reforecasting our revenues. Now, there are some reasons for that. If you look at this forecast, I mentioned to you before, a large part of this, over 60%, is withholding. If you look at last year, from December through June of last year, we collected $8.1 billion in withholding. This budget, the interim budget, we have to collect $8.4 billion to get there. So that continues to mean we have to increase employment as we go out in here. So I just wanted to point out, I've heard people say, well, we're going to go up against easy numbers in the fourth quarter, our April through June next year, and that's not necessarily so because our employment held up. Now, we do have a little bit maybe in sales taxes. Last year, from December through June, we collected $2.3 billion, and this budget only needs to collect $2.1 billion to make the budget for the year. However, let me point out, last year we had a hoarding of food and sales and storage things in March and May. It was the prime months last year for the internet sales. And I don't know if you just read in the, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal this morning, retail sales in November fell. And the Christmas season is not off to a good start. So we'll see if this continues, the trends we've looked at. But I don't necessarily believe that it's going to be an all clear just because of what happened in the fourth quarter of last year. And as you recall, the housing market continues to boom. We would have to collect more monies in recordation, so we're counting on that to happen. Corporate sales last year, corporate taxes were $700 million between December and June. This budget implies we have to collect $825 million. But the real issue related to this forecast comes down to the most volatile revenue source we have, and that's non-withholding. As you all recall last year, go back to one of the first graphs I showed you in this slide deck, we had a tremendous June because we collected more of the non-withholding than we were anticipating. We actually made our budget. And as you recall, that's the second year in a row we've had significant increases in non-withholding. I don't know if that'll hold up this year or not. A lot of that has to do with wealth generation and the stock market and people selling businesses. So we'll have to see it. And 50% of that revenue is collected in April, May, and June. So I would just caution us all to remember that we'll get a little more insight of this into January, but we still have this non-withholding out there that has been in our favor the last 2 years. Our history has been that's not been the case as we look back, and I've showed you graphs of that in the past. Now, one thing I wanted to mention to you is the governor did. He has proposed putting another $650 million into cash reserves, and that's a good distinction to make because those are things we can get to working with the General Assembly. And as he mentioned, this came from cash balances that we've had. Remember, we were going to put this in the budget last year. It was in the original budget. We decided not to make some $900 million of this reserve deposit, and we're proposing to put back $650 million. So it does give us a little bit of cushion as we go forward if, in fact, we have a downturn. I know Dan Timberlake will talk a little bit more of that, but I wanted to point that also helped us underpin this forecast, pushing a little bit because we knew we had some additional cash balances that may be available to us. Now, the next steps we will go from here is we will look at this again in January. We'll get the national economic outlook, and we'll know a lot more about holiday sales and the impact of any federal budget agreements. or stimulus, which could help us as we go through here. Certainly, December 15th is a big day for estimated quarter income tax payments, so we'll know more about that. And then, of course, at the end of January, we'll have a lot more about retail sales collections that happen during the holiday period. Now, I understand that this is a short session that we have coming up. The governor, in his speech, said that if, in fact, we do have additional revenues, that his priority would be to make the teacher bonus into a permanent raise. And so to be able to make those decisions, we will try to get this information to you as quickly as possible, but probably around the 1st of February is probably going to be the earliest that we would have it. Now, a couple more things before I turn this over to Dan. I want to talk a little bit about structural balance, and Dan's going to have a slide on this and be a little more in detail. We typically think of structural balance as making sure, as the governor said, and you've heard Dan and I say many times, and your staff, Directors Keyes and Oman, mentioned this during their presentation at the retreats, is making sure we have ongoing revenues to support ongoing expenditures. And that is true over the long term. We have to do that, and that's the way we typically look at it. However, we know we're in a fairly like term. In other words, we've had a dramatic shutdown of economic activity that may rebound relatively quickly depending upon whether or not this vaccine works as we think it's going to happen in that. What we really look at structural balance is, do we have the resources necessary to make sure that we can cover our core operating expenses during good times and bad in that. And that's really what it's sustainability is really a lot more about this. So when we were putting this budget together, we were really thinking about how far can we go to spend in ongoing operations, yet making sure we were fiscally prudent and making sure we weren't digging a hole for the future. And that underpinned quite a bit of the discussions, and the governor touched on some of those in his speech. We know ultimately to get the economy back on track, we have to fix the health situation. We have to get the public confidence back out there, and that gets back to the vaccine. But in the interim, we're going to have to deal with making sure we support the efforts on public health. So in this particular budget, Dan will go into, there's a significant amount of items spent on pandemic relief. In fact, over $230 million in direct costs. And if you throw in policy implications, it could be many hundreds of millions more than that. So we felt like we had to push to make sure that Virginians were, first of all, taken care of in terms of the vaccination program the governor talked about, PPE, other things that Dan will go through in more detail. As I pointed out, we also knew we were going to have increasing revenues. That is the majority view going forward, even over and above this budget. I'm not suggesting we should always look at that, but certainly had we looked out in the outgoing years and thought we were going to have a decrease, that may have changed our judgment on how far we could go in terms of some of these expenditures we're looking at going forward here. As I pointed out, the addition to cash reserves also gives us that bridge. If it takes longer to recover, that we have some revenues there, some available cash resources to keep these programs going. It doesn't give us the all is well signal to go spend freely, but it does say on those things that are related to the pandemic, getting Virginians back on their feet, moving forward with some of the programs the governor mentioned, that we do have some cushion to get us over if, in fact, we do hit a hiccup. Now, I wanted to point out, we just finished it, and of course there could be a snowstorm in some places around the Commonwealth as we speak, but we are now less than 6 months from the next hurricane season. And as you all look back a few years ago, and I can't remember the name of the storm, but that major storm that hit North Carolina, had it been 200 miles north and hit Virginia, we would have been out a couple $1 billion until we got reimbursements from the Fed. So, as the governor pointed out, the pandemic has taught us that we have to make sure we have reserves there to help us out if, in fact, we had an unexpected event. Otherwise, we'll be caught having to cut core services as we move forward, and we're still in the middle of this pandemic. The governor did mention the reduction in the Virginia retirement system. It's $100 million. This will not only pay off a debt from the last recession of over $61 million, but it will also help us offset future contributions from the general fund, about $25 million, and help localities, their portion, in the future. And this is what I was pointing to earlier when I said with low interest rates, we may want to rethink how we look at liabilities. The Virginia retirement system has a discount rate of 6.75%. I don't think anybody on this call, if you are earning more than a few percentage points on your cash, please let me know, because in this low environment, you have to take a lot of risks to get there. So when interest rates are near zero, if we can pay off a liability that's close to 6.75%, it makes a lot of sense in helping us move forward and protecting the general fund from expenditures in the future. So I point that out. We've put $100 million in here. If we look at one-time monies in the future, this may be something that could help really be a good use of monies. The governor mentioned how, and I have mentioned about how we compare to other states. When you look at that, considering with the rating agency, we have talked with the rating agencies. They certainly don't like to see structural imbalance. However, when you look at other states having to borrow monies for operations, I've had conversations with the rating agencies, are using reserves and a little bit of liquidity to go in the future. They think that is a very, very wise decision as to how we have handled this pandemic going forward. We have added to spending, yet we have cushioned ourselves and giving us opportunities if in case we hit a hiccup. And the final thing is the federal stimulus. Obviously, if we get more money in the federal stimulus and we can offset some of the monies in the general fund, that will be very helpful to us also. So just wanted to give you a quick overview of how we made the decisions and looked at structural balance in this budget. The last thing, Madam Chair, I'll talk about, there are several slides in here regarding the CARES Act and stimulus funds. This is a detailed list of how all the monies have been spent or obligated. I'll point out here that this is a little different than was in the budget was passed, and that has to do with you gave the governor flexibility to move monies between funds. I'll also point out to you that we anticipate giving no money back to the federal authorities. Any money that hasn't been obligated will go to pay, or hasn't been spent, will go to the VEC Unemployment Assistance Fund. So we will not be returning any monies back to the feds. Hopefully they will give us an extension on this. I had a conversation with Senator Warner, and he anticipates that we will get an extension, but obviously it has to be passed. The last thing I'll end on, Madam Chair, is budget does require that if there are any money sent to the state that have to be appropriated, it has to be done by the General Assembly in the budget, meaning that those monies cannot be spent until this budget is signed. So we will work very closely with you as we go through this budget cycle, and hopefully we will get some additional spending. So, Madam Chair, that concludes my presentation. You'll find all this. There's a lot more history on our website if anybody wants to go through in detail. And with that, Madam Chair, if I'll either take questions or you can call Mr. Timberlake for the next presentation.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. I think what I'll do is ask if there are any questions for you at this point, and request anyone who would like to be recognized to please state your name, because I don't have everybody on my screen.
Senator Howell, this is Senator Evan.
Senator Evan.
I wanted to ask the Secretary about the Federal CARES Act money that was used for rent relief. The governor said there was about $40 million allocated to 13,000 households. I was just wondering if that was that met the need, or if we're short on that. I don't know how the pipeline is for people applying, and
To answer your question, Senator Emmett, I don't know if it's met the total need. I do know that they are still putting the money out. They have not spent all the money that have been allocated.
Thank you.
Any further questions?
Madam Chair, this is Mark. Madam Chair, this is Mark Sickles.
Yes, Delegate Sickles.
Madam Chair,
Delegate Sickles?
thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to ask the Secretary. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Can you hear me? I'm off mute.
I can hear you, sir.
My question for the Secretary is, okay, if the deadline is removed in the next coronavirus, reach the December 30 deadline, how would you reprogram, if at all, the $210 million that would go into the DEC trust fund?
Well, the current language, Delegate Sickles, does allow the governor to move it around within categories that were stipulated in the budget. I can tell you we have had requests, particularly Governor mentioned Rebuild Virginia, that we could reallocate monies there. Certainly, there are other agencies, and we were planning to do that anyway. If we had more time, it would not necessarily mean it would all go to the Unemployment Insurance Trust. It would give us more time to allocate it, and I guess certainly we would work with the money staffs, committee staffs in that. But it would probably mean a better allocation of specifically where we'd like the money to go to based on the need. And the Rebuild Virginia comes up, I know is one. I will tell you another program that they are spending most of the money is the broadband extension that we put out there. They probably could there. But no doubt we probably, if we had an extension, we would be able to put it elsewhere other than the Employment Trust Fund.
Any further question?
Thank you, Madam.
Yes, Senator Howard. Delegate Tyler.
Delegate Tyler?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Lane, this is Delegate Tyler. How much did the gray machines fill our shortfall in our budgets this year?
Yep, Delegate Tyler and Dan Timberlake will go through this in detail, but with the revised forecast, all the money going from the sales taxes that the gray machine money was going to be used for was re-implemented. In other words, the schools were made whole from the original budget based on the increased forecast. So that money has been repurposed back into the gray machine. So from the school district's point of view in the governor's budget, they got 100%. They got all of the original monies from the sales tax have been reinstated to the school districts.
Senator, Madam Chair, this is a Delegate Scott. I have a question too.
For Delegate Scott.
Mr. Lane, Secretary Lane, question for you related to that gray machine question. How much revenue was that? I missed that. And second question is, you talked about the forecast for holiday sales this season being down, while the same reports indicate that internet sales for holiday season were way up on Black Friday. How much are internet sales hurting our tax base versus brick and mortar traditional sales? Thank you.
Yeah. First question, Delegate, is that it was about $94 million was the gray machine money that is now been reinstated through sales tax to the school districts. And in terms of your second question, the majority of the increases, almost 70% of the increases in our taxes this year, our sales taxes, are related to the internet. Traditional retailers are way down. In fact, many of them, including national chains, probably will not come back into existence. So, and it's been a shift, not just internet sales, it's been a shift away from services like in restaurants and leisure and hospitality into goods. And of course, most of those goods are being bought online. So it's been sort of a double whammy to the traditional retailers. So they are significantly struggling. But even with internet sales, national sales were still down for the holiday 1% in November.
Madam Chair, I wanted to understand, is that impacting the revenue that the state of Virginia, Commonwealth is collecting?
Most of that, Delegate Scott, has been offset by internet sales. So no, actually the internet sales have been a positive. Had we not had the Wayfair legislation, we would not have this revenue revision related to sales tax increases. We would have been way down. So actually the internet sales have been the reason for the increase in the sales tax revision. So it's actually helped the Commonwealth.
Thank you.
Further questions?
Madam Chair, it's Delegate Hurst.
Delegate Hurst.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good to see you, Secretary Lane. The forecast for gray machines was over 100 million. I think it was like 150, 160 million, and now we have 90 million that's come in. Is there an explanation for the difference there?
Yeah, the difference is actually the estimate. It was about 120 million, as I recall, but after getting the first checks from the gray machines industry, it looks like it's going to be substantially less, well, not substantially, but less than that. Of course, it'll be what it is, Delegate Hurst, but that's where we are now. Of course, many of those locations, as you know, were closed for a while for the gray machines. They were in establishments, bars and stuff that were shut down. And they were able to move them, but of course, a lot of that hit during the pandemic, and that's been the reduction in the gray machine monies.
Any other questions?
Madam Chairman, Senator Newman.
Senator Newman.
Good morning, Madam Chair. Good morning, Mr. Lane. My question is about DEC. The policy that was announced related to allowing payments when there's a dispute filed, have you been able to calculate, one, how much that's going to add to the debt, and two, have we even started to look at how much that could add to the number that are filed, therefore even adding more? In other words, have you really got your arms around kind of what the impact that policy change is going to make for DEC?
Senator Newman, I know that DEC is working on that. I do not know the answer to your question. But I do know they are calculating that. Dan, do you have anything from there? Well, I know they're working on it. Dr. Healy is aware of that, and we've asked them for that computation.
Madam Chair, if that information can be provided to the committees, that would be helpful. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Of course. Any other question?
Madam Chair, this is Delegate Mugler.
Delegate Mugler.
Hi, thank you, Madam Chair. Question for Secretary Lane. You mentioned that there, with PPP loans, if there's forgiveness, that Virginia will not be taxing those. But you also mentioned that there would be some alignment with some federal taxation. Could you speak to that?
Yes. Currently, that provision is in the CARES Act, meaning that we currently are not conformed to anything in the CARES Act. What the governor has proposed is we would conform to the individual provisions and the PPP loans. Currently, at the federal level, right now, if a loan is forgiven, a PPP loan forgiven, then it is not taxed. Consequently, that business does not get to deduct all the expenses it used that for, like payroll and rent. It can't deduct that, so it's a net zero. They don't have to pay tax on the income, but they don't get to deduct those expenditures. In Virginia right now, we would tax the income but allow the company to deduct the expenditures. But what we're proposing is to conform to the federal level for those that are forgiven to make sure it's the same wash so that that they're not impacted differently for the state. I know a lot of people would like to get the loan forgiven and still get to deduct the expenses, but I don't think I know the feds don't allow that, and Virginia would not allow that either. But we want to be the same as what the feds are doing in that.
Thank you very much.
Is there a further question? Okay, if not, thank you, Mr. Secretary. And I understand you're going to stay till the end of the next presentation and would take questions then as well.
Yes, Madam Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so next we will hear from Dan Timberlake. He is the director of the Department of Planning and Budget, and he will talk about the further implications of the budget. Welcome, Dan.
Good morning. I'm transitioning to setup here. Okay. Good morning, Madam Chairman and members of the House Appropriations, Senate Finance and Appropriations, and House Finance Committee. It's a pleasure to be here with you again. I realize it was just August that we were doing this, but we're here again. Wanted to give you a perspective on the budget that is to give you context this year. The governor went through a lot of the details relative to his initiatives, so you'll hear me repeat some of those, but I want to try to present those in a little bit of context for you. As is normal when I start this presentation, what I usually do is try to give you the starting point for this budget, which, as you know, you just passed Chapter 56 during the special session. And in that budget, you finished that budget with an unappropriated balance of about $302 million. If you look down in the bottom right-hand side of this slide, you'll see that $302.2 million is the unappropriated balance at the end of the biennium based on that budget. That is the starting point for this budget. Normally, what I would be doing at this stage in this presentation, though, is that I would be walking you through all the year-end adjustments and adjustments to the balance sheet and so forth. But because we did that in August, I don't have to do that here. So this literally is the starting point. There are no adjustments to this because we've already accounted for all those year-end close adjustments in this budget, Chapter 56. So the only thing that we have to work with now in terms of adjustments to the resources are the things that Secretary Lane has already mentioned to you, which are the revisions to the GACR revenue forecast, the GACR revisions for transfers. There's a handful of miscellaneous transfer adjustments, and as you can see, they don't amount to even barely $100,000 total. And then you've got the policy adjustments that Secretary Lane has already mentioned and y'all have discussed in detail relative to the CARES Act conformity. And then there's one slight adjustment to agricultural equipment tax credits that will be related to legislation being proposed. At the end of that, though, what you see is the top section of this sheet shows you what the resources were in Chapter 56. The middle section shows you what the resources are that are being revised in this budget, which amount to a little over $1.2 billion, or $1,257 million. That ties back to the forecast that Secretary Lane just went over with you. So the revised revenue forecast is in the bottom section of this table here. And in total, then, what you're dealing with in terms of total general fund resources are $24.2 billion in fiscal year 21, the current year, $23.4 billion in the next fiscal year, for a total of $47.6 billion. Okay, so those are the resources that we're working with. Now we can go into the spending that's in this budget proposal. What you see here, there's 4 highlights that I wanted to just touch on that are embedded within the governor's proposed budget. The first is obviously to respond to the ongoing needs of the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the things that's important to point out in this budget is that, and Secretary Lane and the governor both alluded to it, there is no federal stimulus package after December 30th in general. There are specific CARES Act grants that will continue, the biggest of which is the CDC grant for the continuation of a testing program. But there is no money for a vaccination program. There is no money for PPE. There is no money for other things that we have been using the coronavirus relief funds from the CARES Act for up until this point. So there are going to be some recommendations related to the ongoing needs there. There is going to be, as the governor mentioned and Secretary Lane mentioned, a deposit to the revenue reserve, $650 million. There's also going to be some proposals to restore some of the priority programs that you guys allotted last spring and you looked again at during the special session. And then finally, we're going to talk about liquidity and the ability to be able to maintain government operations and pay our bills. So, highlights, or high-level summary rather. Whoops. Think we lost the presentation, maybe? Okay. Give them just a minute to get it back up. Okay. This is a high-level summary of the actions in this budget. There are 222 amendments that actually will spend $2.4 billion. But against that, we actually had $907 million worth of savings related to 28 different amendments. And the total net spending in this budget is about $1.5 billion. So we'll be spending down some of that $302 million balance in this budget. Still have a pretty good unappropriated balance at the end, but you'll see that it does come down. So the spending, though, as I already mentioned, focuses on the revenue reserve relief or investments for the COVID-19 pandemic response. There's compensation bonuses for teachers and bonuses for state employees and state-supported local employees. There's some restorations, and then there's additional investments in housing and broadband, as the governor's already mentioned. Some of the savings areas, though, that haven't been mentioned yet are revisions in the public education enrollment forecast and the participation levels that are formula calculations from those enrollment changes. There's a change in the Medicaid program that actually yields savings, largely from an extension of the FMAP for one more quarter. Then there's additional savings that we have related to debt service. And then we also use non-general fund revenues where we could offset general fund expenses, which is a typical thing that we would do. So let's look at then the top 10 spending items that are in this budget. 75% of the new spending that's in this budget, at $2.4 billion, 75% of it are in these top 10 items. There's only about 25% that remains in the remaining 212 spending items after the top 10. The biggest expenditure in this is the $650 million for the revenue reserve. The next biggest expenditure is what the governor was alluding to, which is a no-loss provision for public education. Now, I will talk about this a little more, but I will point out that this is probably one of the biggest things that we need to be doing in the context of trying to keep the fiscal integrity of local school systems in place, and also actually protecting you in the future when we go back to normal. But I'll get into more detail on that in a minute. Then you'll see the third item is the $100 million down payment rather to the retirement system. The majority of that will go to pay off that deferred contribution to the teachers' retirement fund from the last recession. And then you have the bonuses for state employees, and you have the mass vaccination effort, and then you have some additional expenses there related to sales tax revisions in public education, the 2% bonus for teachers, the disaster recovery or response, and that's what we're terming that, and as it relates to the Department of Emergency Management, that's their component of the COVID-19 response. And then there's some additional payments in the direct aid budget, which we'll get into more detail. And this has to do with the gray machines. You had originally proposed money to be used in public education from the gray machine revenue to replace lost sales tax revenue. The governor's actually proposing to replace that with general fund money so that the school divisions remain held harmless, but the gray machine revenue will go back into the COVID-19 relief fund and be available for other pandemic response needs there. Then lastly, the intercity rail proposal that you heard about earlier. So let's look then at the savings, the top 10 items in the savings. And what you see here is that 95% of the savings in this budget are related to these top 10 items, the first of which is the enrollment forecast in public education. What's important here, and this is where I'll talk a little more about the details of this proposal, is what's important is what we did in this was to try to preserve the integrity of the way the funding formulas work in public education. We allowed all of the enrollment changes and all the participation level changes that are associated with those enrollment changes and all the fall membership data to run through the education formulas the way that they normally would. That allows everybody to see what the true calculations and the effect of that enrollment, those downward enrollment numbers generated. What we did, though, is when we got to the end of that, after we'd run that through all those programs and all the places that those changes occur, as we said, did school divisions and we did this division by division. What we said was, did any school division get less money this year than they thought they were going to get last year when you passed the budget, before you had to make any of these adjustments? So what we did is we said, if they got less, we will make you whole to the number that you thought you were going to get last spring when you got your numbers from the state and you adopted your local budget on those numbers. What that does is that allows school divisions who entered into teacher contracts last spring, who made purchases and contracts at the beginning of the year, it allows them to be able to operate without having to suffer the loss from the downward revisions in enrollment. We did allow, though, for school divisions who did have upward adjustments in enrollment to be able to get the additional money that would go with those upward adjustments. There are a handful of school divisions that did have upward adjustments in enrollment. So this no loss is generated as a calculation at the end of the calculations after we've made all the downward revisions for enrollment or other forms of loss, and this restores them back to the level that they thought that they were going to get when you passed the budget last spring. What's important about that is that if we don't do that, then we would be reducing funding to a large number of school divisions mid-year this year. You actually had language in Chapter 56 that directed the Department of Education not to do that. So this is just a follow-on to the logic that you were proposing in Chapter 56. In fiscal year 2022, the reason why this is so important to you is because if the vaccine program works, and if we go back to normal, if we take all that money out of public education today as savings today, and then everything goes back to normal in the fall, and all these kids come back to school in the fall, then we're going to have a huge hole in the budget at the beginning of the school year. So it's really important to have this in there, either to protect them from the losses that might occur if enrollment doesn't return, but also to protect you against having a hole in the state's budget if, in fact, the vaccine program works and everything goes back to normal. So that's the reason why it was done that way, but we wanted to make sure that we let the formulas run the way that they would normally run so that we didn't have any artificial adjustments midway through the process of trying to calculate what the effect of the enrollment change was. Okay, the next item here on the savings is the change to the Medicaid utilization and inflation, and as you can see, it's a huge savings in the first year of $245 million. About $205 million of that is the net savings related to the enhanced federal match. You'll see that in the second year there is a slight increase in cost. The third item is the adjustments for the healthcare fund. There is a large cash balance available from the prior year that came forward to the first year of the biennium, which is why it's $53.9 million in the first year and only $5.2 million in the second year. But this is where we get additional revenues in the healthcare fund that are used to offset general fund costs in the Medicaid budget. Lottery proceeds. One of the reasons why we believe that the gray machine revenue is not as much as what was originally forecast is because people weren't going into the stores to buy that. But what they were doing, to our surprise, is they were buying lottery tickets. The lottery is not seeing the loss of revenue from the fact that the gray machines are still out there. So there was actually an uptick in the lottery revenue forecast, which allows us to use that money to offset general fund costs. So that's what you see on this line here. The uptick was $27 million in 2021 and $24.7 million in 2022. Then we have the debt service savings in the Treasury Board, and that's just the debt service that we pay on bonds for state-supported projects. Those are savings related to the changes in the market and the better interest rates that we're seeing right now. Then we have some additional adjustments that are in the next two items that are related to just additional extensions of changes in the participation level due to downward revisions in school enrollment. They're the lottery-funded programs. That's not related to the lottery revenue itself, but it's the programs funded by lottery. The cost of them went down because of the enrollment declines. Same thing with the English as a second language adjustment. And there's another adjustment related to that that's an upward adjustment for English second language learners that's later in this presentation. Then we had some additional adjustments related to the Medicaid forecast. And then lastly, you'll see that there's a savings in the Children's Services Act, a very small savings, about $5 million total for the biennium. All right, let's look at that in terms of where that breaks down by secretarial area. When you look at this by secretarial area, you'll see that the net spending goes up by the $1.5 billion in total, but you'll see that the majority of that spending is concentrated within the Education and Finance Secretariats. The biggest reason why finance is as big as it is because the $100 million that's a payment to the VRS trust and the $650 million payment to the Revenue Reserve are both in the Finance Secretariat there in the Department of Accounts transfer payments. You'll see that on a slide in just a minute. But that's the reason why finance is as big as it is. If it weren't for that, the Finance Secretary would actually be a negative because of the debt service savings and Treasury Board. Education is up because of the no-loss funding in K-12, but also because of the G3 and because of the tuition, student financial aid rather, in higher ed that's supporting that spending increase. So let's go on then next to what this looks like by agency. What you see here are the top 10 agencies by growth in terms of total dollars. Department of Accounts transfer payments, as I just mentioned, is the largest. The next one is the direct aid to public education budget, which is the money that goes to public school divisions. It's $270 million, largely buffeted by the no-loss payments that we were just talking about. Then you'll see central appropriations, and that's because of that's where the money for the bonuses are appropriated. That's also where some additional money for internal service fund payments to agencies for general operations of government are located. Department of Health and Department of Emergency Management are buffeted by or increased rather by the amounts that we're putting in for the pandemic response. Housing and Community Development, you'll see those increases there. Those are related to the broadband funding and the housing trust funding that are being restored in those two in that budget. Then rail and public transportation is the $50 million for the intercity passenger rail initiative. Community colleges is largely the G3 initiative. Conservation and recreation, the biggest reason for that is environmental quality and the money that we actually have in the budget for additional water quality assistance. Virginia Employment Commission, we'll get into the detail of that, but that's support for them for the additional staffing that they need right now and additional investments in technology, and then also the interest payments that they will have to make on the monies that are being borrowed. So those are the top 10. Then you have 60 agencies that actually have increases in spending of about $20 million, a little less than $20 million across the board. And then you have 4 agencies that actually have negative spending. And I think Mines, Minerals, and Energy is related to a reorganization. The Children's Services Act is just a formula change in terms of the actual forecast there. Treasury Board is the debt service savings, and medical assistance services, as I've mentioned, are the revisions in the Medicaid forecast. So if you were to just graph that, let's see what that looked like on a graph, you'll see that Department of Accounts transfer payments is by far the largest expenditure for a single agency proposed in this budget, followed by the direct aid to public education, and you come on down and you'll see the negatives in the 4 agencies at the bottom. Okay, so one of the things we thought we'd do is we would try to break these proposed spending items into categories to give you context of how they were spent. So this is not in priority order in terms of importance. This is in descending order of where the money went. The restoration of prior budget reductions is the largest area, largely because of the $650 million for the Revenue Reserve. The pandemic response is next. Other spending or initiatives is the third item at $372 million. New initiatives, $176 million. The information technology at $64 million. Those are specific information technology projects that have been reviewed by VITA and will go forward, are being proposed to go forward. And then you have savings in the last 4 categories, which are the reorganization at Mines, Minerals, and Energy. Then there are savings in caseload and workload adjustments, the area of unanticipated cost increases, and then also in the area of mandates. And most of those you've already heard me talk about in detail, or I've mentioned the main drivers of those, but we'll have a little more information here to look at. So when we look at this on a secretarial area basis, again, what you see here is in the restoration area, and this is now limited to the category of restorations, not total spending, but just restorations. What you'll see is the Education Secretariat stands out as being the area of the greatest amount of restorations. The Finance Secretariat, again, is the biggest overall, but that's because of the revenue reserve. And then we'll take a deeper look at this on the next slide here. On the next slide, you'll see that the reason why education is the biggest area after the reserves is because of restoration of the G3 program, the restoration of the student financial assistance in higher ed, restoration of the guidance counselors, which moves that ratio to 1 to 325. And then you have the additional money going into the Natural Resources Commitment Fund for water quality. And then you have the Early Childhood Initiative. The last component that hadn't been restored yet was the pre-kindergarten component related to that. Then you'll see there's money here for the Massey Cancer Center being restored. The Family First Prevention Services, you restored a component of that during the special session. This is the last component, the last big component of that. There's some smaller components of this throughout the budget, but this is the last big component that needed to be restored. And then Governor mentioned the restorations to Norfolk State and Virginia State. Virginia State is being restored. It's not on this list because it didn't make the top 10, but it is out there. Norfolk State just barely makes it over the top 10 mark. Then you'll see the restorations environmental quality, and if you look at the next one after this, it would be the TAG grant that he mentioned as well. But those top 10 restorations get you to about 90% of the total money that's being restored in this budget. If you go to the next slide and you look at this, what's important about this slide, we're going to now shift to the pandemic response. But one of the things that I wanted to just point out to you is that one of the things that is helping us to pay for the pandemic response, which is that second bar after the restorations, that second bar is a pandemic response. The total money being spent on that is $751 million. Well, if you look at what we saved in those other areas of workload adjustments and mandates, it's $766 million worth of savings there. So that is essentially giving us the resources that we need to be able to continue the pandemic effort. Then you'll see the other spending and initiatives at 372, and the new spending initiatives at 176, and then the information technology at 64 million. Those are the same numbers you saw in the first chart, but I thought it was probably really important to be able to see this in the context because of the way that the savings help us to pay for the pandemic response. So if we dive down a little more into the pandemic response detail, these are the top 10 expenditures in the pandemic response. And you'll see that 98.9% of this is in the top 10, the first of which is the biggest of all, and that's the no loss funding to the public school system. Were it not for the pandemic, we wouldn't be doing this. We would have been just taking the normal enrollment adjustments, taking the savings and moving on down the road. But because that is all related to the pandemic and the need to keep them on solid ground in terms of their financial support from the state, that's why we put this in the pandemic response category. The next one is the mass vaccination program with the Department of Health. As I think you're probably aware, the pandemic funding will pay for, or the federal government, I should say, will pay for the vaccine. That's what we've been told. But there is no additional support for the state after that. We will have to stand up the software that's needed to track people getting vaccines, the media campaigns that have to go out to make people aware of the vaccines, where to go to get them, try to alleviate some of the fears that are related to the vaccine. There's a whole lot of information that the health department has that backs up these estimates. But again, this is assuming that we get no additional assistance from the federal government. Were we to get a package from the federal government that would pay for some of this, then you would be able to back off on some of this spending. Same thing with the next item, in the Department of Emergency Management, the additional spending there. After December 30th, there is no source of funding from the federal government to pay for PPE. The lion's share of this money is going toward PPE. There's additional money that's going to work with the Health Equity Commission to continue some of the contracts that we have for some of the surveillance and forecasting data and things of that sort. But the lion's share of that is for PPE. The next thing you see here is for the health department, and that is the money that's related to a communication campaign related around the vaccine and continued testing. Then you'll see this is where I was talking about earlier, where we, if we were to let the English language, English as a second language data run as normal, there would have been a downturn in that, but this is where we're putting back some money to use a proxy for the English language learners' estimates of what school division funding needs to be. So we're using proxies, and that's what this particular amendment is funding. I've already mentioned the unemployment assistance at VEC, which are three of the next four here. Again, the first one here is to support staffing at VEC. The next one is on the interest that we'll have to pay back to the federal government should they not give us relief from the money that we're borrowing from them right now. This assumes that we will have to pay the interest on that, and we will have to pay that money back. And then the next one is not related to VEC, but it's related to the mental health treatment centers, and that is for PPE and additional surveillance activities within those mental health facilities. The next one is the VEC, and that is related to the systems issues that they need to change and upgrade, and they're using a lot of legacy systems for the unemployment program that we're dealing with right now related to the pandemic and some of the additional programs the Fed stood up. This is to allow them to be able to integrate that into the new system that they're developing. And then lastly is another item for the Department of Health that deals with our surveillance and investigation of the COVID disease. So those are, like I said, 99% of the total spending. So in the area of new initiatives, the first one here is using general fund money to replenish the COVID-19 relief fund. When you passed a budget that recognized the loss of sales tax in public education, you used the COVID-19 relief fund, $95 million of that, to make school divisions harmless, to hold them harmless for the sales tax loss that they were going to experience in the current year. They're going to get back a good portion of that from the money that they are getting from the increase in sales tax estimates that Secretary Lane mentioned to you. It's about $42 million the first year that they get back. This is the balance of the money that would have been coming from the COVID-19 relief fund. We're going to replace that with general fund money, so it's no increase to public education, but it is taking that money from the general fund, putting it into public education, and putting that money back into the COVID-19 relief fund so that you and the governor have another resource at your hands to address ongoing COVID-19 issues, because we don't have a package from the federal government right now. We've identified the things that we know about in this, and I just went through those. But there's probably things that we don't know about that we're going to have to deal with as we go forward over the next 10 to 12 months. And that's why that COVID-19 relief fund is going to be so important to us, because that's the safety blanket that we have to deal with things that we don't know right now. The next item on this new initiatives list is the intercity passenger rail service, the $50 million to purchase right away in Southwest Virginia. Then you'll see there's an adjustment here the governor mentioned about re-envisioning Monument Avenue, and that is with the Museum of Fine Arts. The governor also mentioned redoing the information that is, or the data that drives the cooperative health budget. That is the budget that determines what the state and local shares are for health services through the local health departments. That data, based on JLARC reports, has not been updated in a number of years. This is not changing the funding formula. This is just simply updating the data within the formula so that it is more reflective of the current economic activity in the various localities and what their real ability to pay for those services are. As the governor mentioned, there is also a no loss in that, or hold harmless, so that if those changes do generate a loss of funding for a particular locality, they will be held harmless from that loss. So there is an adjustment for that in that as well. The governor mentioned the Richmond Slave Trail site, and this is additional $9 million to continue the funding for that initiative. Then there's some additional money here for a technology development grant program. This is tied to, I believe, a new grant that will be issued by, or was approved by MEI. Then you'll see that there's additional funding here for the appellate court for 4 more judges and the support staff that go with that. There's 4 judges, and then there's 23 support staff that are supported by this money. The governor mentioned Project Harmony and the restorations of the issues related there. Then you have an additional spending here for the multi-use trails through Department of Transportation, and that's for the, I believe in the past you may have heard of the term Rails to Trails. This is a similar type of initiative related to that. And then the last thing on this list is money to support a pilot program for diversion and discharge for individuals with dementia. That represents about 90% of the spending in the new initiatives area. The other 10% is spread over 29 other initiatives, the detail of which we've given to your staff, and we'd be glad to talk about you in greater length at another time if you'd like. Okay, let's look at the caseloads and the unavoidable increases now. If we look at that particular information, again, these are the top 10 spending items in this, and what you see here is that even though that there are net savings at the end of the day, there are some items that cost us additional money. The first item here is vehicle replacement for the Department of State Police. The issue here is that they do have money in their base budget for replacement of vehicles, but because of changes by the manufacturers and changes related to their needs for equipment and STARS, there's a compatibility issue in terms of what vehicles are available that meet their requirements and that will also support the technology that they have. And as a result, there's additional costs related to the replacement of those vehicles. And $9.5 million is what they believe that they need to continue that program at its current pace of replacement and its current replacement cycle. Then you'll see there's some other small spending items here related to social services and CSA, some additional money for inaugural events that will be coming up a year from now. We have to put that money in the budget now so it's available when those expenses start to roll in the door. Then you'll see there's an additional workforce adjustment grant here that is related with economic development, and that is an adjustment to an existing grant award based on the performance of the company doing a little bit better than they were according to the schedule. They're ahead of the schedule that they were initially on. Then you'll see that there's money here for security enhancements at the Bon Air Juvenile Correctional Center. There's additional money here with DCR for some natural heritage safety and access needs. Then there's money related to the corrections health budget related to address the shortfall in the drug assessment program. There's money here for workload adjustments at the Attorney General's office, and then there's additional money here to fund the statewide minimum wage increase in the comp board. There are a few positions there that needed to be adjusted to address the minimum wage increase that we all know is coming. So let's look then at the mandate spending in this budget. Again, this area has savings overall, but there are a few items in this budget that do have costs associated with it. One of them, the very first one, is formula-driven related to the sales tax that goes to public education. Then the next item here is money for the inmate medical care at the Department of Corrections. Then you'll see some additional spending related to a variety of health and human service programs. And then there's an adjustment in direct aid for the census that is used to distribute the sales tax. And then you'll see at the very end there's adjustments for the Department of Taxation to support the component of the facilitated enrollment program that they will have to administer. So with that, that concludes my overview of the operating budget. A quick review then of the capital budget. You'll see that there is additional spending here, but we were very limited in what we were looking at in terms of approving new projects. The only things that we did were upgrades and facility repairs and life safety projects, things that we needed to do to address commitments that were already out there, like the tech talent pipeline and the workforce. We had to supplement the Central State Hospital project. We have planning for 2 projects here in the seat of government that we want to fund the planning for. Then we have equipment for projects that have previously been approved and are coming online that we have to fund. Then we have a few 9C and 9D projects. And then we actually have some unused bond authority that we're going to revert at the end of the day. When you look at that in terms of how that impacts our debt, you'll see that the life safety projects is about $55.9 million of cost. That's the biggest piece of that, of the maintenance piece. And then there's some upgrades that are at 6.2. Then the supplement for the Central State Hospital is the largest overall increase at $58.5 million. Equipment is 6.8. Tech talent and Gunston Hall at 9.1. And then again, you see the savings there. And that totals $135 million of additional debt that we would be authorizing if you were to approve that. We have just over $500 million worth of debt capacity based on the latest run of the debt capacity model. The Debt Capacity Advisory Committee will actually be meeting tomorrow to look at the revised debt capacity, but it's not likely to change much from that, so there's more than sufficient capacity to absorb this additional debt that's being proposed in this budget. So when you take all those operating changes and you take those capital changes, because there are some cash capital projects being proposed, mostly for the planning at $18 million. You put all that together, the increase in total spending is $1.5 billion. When you put that against the appropriations that are in Chapter 56, then you end up with general fund appropriations being recommended $22.7 billion in the current year, $24.8 billion in fiscal year 22 next year, for a total of $47,587 million over the biennium. So when you lay those expenditures in against the resources that I showed you at the beginning of this presentation, you end this budget with a $51 million unappropriated balance. Now, what I want to point out on this slide, though, is on the bottom line, because if you've heard me talk in the past, you've heard me talk about sort of the 3 legs of the stool that relates to fiscal integrity, the first being liquidity, the second being structural balance, and the third being reserves. What this shows us is that at the end of the current fiscal year 21, our unappropriated balance is going to be $1,488 million. That is a lot of liquidity for us. If we were to have an economic shock between now and the end of the year, this is what will protect us and this is what will buffer us. When you look at the next year, though, that is negative. But a large reason why that is negative is because of a lot of one-time adjustments or one-time expenditure items that are built in that we will be taking out going forward. And I have a slide that will address that. But the biggest of which is there is the $650 million deposit to the revenue reserve that is planned for the end of the second year. What that means is that liquidity that you have that gets you through this year, you still have in your control going into the budget next January. You still have $650 million of that. So instead of this unappropriated balance being $51 million, next January, if you had a problem, you actually have, if you were to adopt this budget with no changes, you would actually have about $700 million of liquidity in your hands next January. That is important. Liquidity does several things for you. The biggest thing is it gives you options. It gives you time. It gives you the ability to be considerate about the things that you need to do if you have to make adjustments, but it gives you time to explore those options. So that's an important component of this that I wanted to point out to you. Let's move then to the next slide. So the next slide shows you how we would adjust that end of year balance in fiscal year 22 to get to what is the true structural balance deficit that we have right now. And you go through this adjustment and you'll see you take out the revenue reserve, you take out the bonuses, you take out all the other one-time expenditures that are embedded in the second year. And when you get down to the end of that mark, you see that the structural imbalance is $366 million. But that you have to keep in context is in a recessionary economy. So almost all of that would go away if we were back on our revenue forecast that we originally had a year ago. So that's an important thing to keep in mind here is we do have a structural balance issue in front of us, and it's likely to stay with us as long as we're in a slow economy. But as we come out of that, the rate at which we come out of it will have a lot to say about how much of that structural balance problem we really have. The key thing here, though, is we don't want to make this worse because this is in front of us. We have cash and reserves that if we have to use those, we can going forward to give us a glide path to the point at which our revenues catch up to our expenditure base. But it's important to recognize what it is and to understand what choices you have in front of you to make, whether to make that, take more risk with that or to try to ameliorate the risk associated with that. So then, let's talk then, so that's the second leg of the stool. The third leg of the stool is the reserves. The top half of this shows you where we would be with reserves at the end of fiscal year 22 if we didn't make that deposit. So we would be at, and this is, point out that this slide does not account for interest earnings. This is just coming off of the actual cash balance at the end of last year and the actual deposits that are scheduled to be made. So if we didn't know anything else right now, we would be making deposits based on what's already been approved, and the balance would be about $1.2 billion, which would put us at about 5.3% of total revenues and transfers in the second year. With the $650 million deposit, though, that's being proposed in the bottom half of that, you'll see that that takes the balance up to about $1.9 billion, or just shy of $1.9 billion before interest. And that puts us just over the 8% mark of revenues and transfers. And then you've already seen this slide. Secretary Lane used this. This slide shows you what that graph looks like. This slide does include interest earnings at about 1% annually. Which is, again, that's a conservative estimate, but this is what it would do. It would jump it from about $1.88 billion to $1.9 billion with the interest by the end of FY22. So what that means, though, is that means that during a recessionary period, even though we have a challenge with the structural balance, we have liquidity and we have reserves. So we have two of the three components to maintain fiscal integrity going into the rest of this pandemic and trying to get through the rest of the recession. So with that, I'm done, and I will take questions. There's additional slides here that are in the appendix for additional information, but I won't go through those.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
Secretary Deeds.
Yes, Senator Deeds.
Dan, there are a whole bunch of people in the area that I represent and across Virginia that are somewhat long-term unemployed because of the pandemic situation. And I'm wondering what would happen if you took a chunk of that money that is supposed to go to reserves, additional that $650 million. You took a chunk of that money and put it into unemployment compensation for some of these long-term unemployed people. What would that do to our structural integrity?
Well, presumably that would be a one-time expense. So it wouldn't change the calculation of the structural balance at the end of the day. It would just reduce the amount of money that's in reserves. In other words, instead of being a one-time adjustment to the structural balance slide that takes it out because it's a one-time deposit to reserves, it would be a one-time payment into the insurance trust, assuming that it didn't go on for beyond this biennium. It would be a one-time payment into the unemployment insurance trust, rather. And so in terms of structural balance, it wouldn't make a change at all, but it would reduce the reserve balance.
Well, Madam Chair,
Senator Deeds.
If you took $200 million of that, say, and you put it into some sort of long-term unemployment benefit for some of these people on a one-time basis, would that affect our AAA bond rate if you're reducing the revenues, or if you're reducing the reserves by that much?
I don't know what that change would mean to the rating agencies, because they look at things holistically. They don't look at things in isolation, but what they do is they look at the they look at those three legs and they look at the things that you're doing in terms of your services. And so the question would be whether they think that because if it's in reserves, it's available to continue services that are critical services if you had a downturned economy, you would be reducing your capacity to be able to not have to reduce services by creating new services. And so it would be hard to understand without a conversation with them how they would react to that. They would certainly understand the need. They would understand the need that you're trying to address, but it would have an impact on other things that they look at. So it's hard to know what the trade-off would be there.
Yeah, Senator Dees, and Dan's exactly right. It would impact their way to look at whether it would actually result in a downgrade. We are taking money out of reserves in a time of increasing revenues, but it is for a pandemic, obviously. So I would say this, the minimum that we were told a few years ago that other AAA rated states had was about 8% in reserves. So but Dan is right. They do look at, for instance, the amount of unfunded liability we have in our pension plan, and we're using some of this to pay that down. So it's partly a arithmetic calculation, partly a subjective calculation. Dan's right, we don't know the answer, but every time we take it out of that, and I think that is I'm not suggesting that's not a good use. I am saying it does shorten one of the lengths of those stools that he talked about. But it's to whether or not that would be enough to change anything, Senator Deeds, I don't know the answer to that.
Thank you.
Sorry, Dan.
Is there any other question for Director Timberline?
Madam Chair, Delegate Sullivan.
Delegate Sullivan.
Dan, I hate to make you repeat yourself, but there was a huge number, I want to say on slide 17, for savings from mandates.
Yes, sir.
Could you just summarize that? Because that's a big number. If you could just summarize again where that comes from, that'd be great.
The savings in the mandates, let me see if I can, I'm going to see if I can pull that slide back up for you real quick so we can talk about that. Yeah, that's it. I apologize. That was his slide in that.
That's mine. You got mine. Yes, all right.
Yeah.
It's the next presentation. Here you go.
The savings that are in the mandates section are driven almost entirely by the enrollment savings in K-12 and the savings in the Medicaid. I can answer your question quickly. Those are the two big pieces. There are various other savings that are in there, like the debt service savings and things of that sort. But that is the biggest piece of. Is this the slide you were thinking about, sir?
That's the slide I was thinking about.
Yeah. Okay. So the caseload and workload adjustments, the unanticipated and unavoidable cost changes, and the mandates, those were actually. Okay, so what you see is that in the caseload area, there were some minor increases in costs, but there were 9 different adjustments that made up those decreases. And if we go back to, actually, I think the best way to look at this is to, I apologize.
Well, no, I've asked you to go back. I owe you an apology. I guess my point is these are not cuts. These are savings that are sort of automatic.
Yes, sir. And that was the key about why they were in the caseloads and mandates. They're not program or service area cuts. This slide here shows you what all of the savings were, but it shows you what the top 10 the savings were. You'll see here the average daily membership was the largest savings in this budget, but that's also being remembered that we have the no-loss provision that's spending most of that money back in school divisions. Then you had a Medicaid utilization and inflation. Then you had the adjustments here that were related to the healthcare fund and the lottery proceeds where we earned additional revenues to replace general fund revenues. Then we had the debt service savings. So they're all formula driven almost entirely. data or formula. They're data driven, I should say. The formulas are not changing. The data are the data within the formulas are changing.
That's very helpful. Thank you for going back for me. I appreciate it.
Sir.
Madam Chairman Watts.
Yes, Delegate Watts.
Thank you. A follow-up, please, to Delegate Sullivan's question. I'm familiar with the enrollment changes for K through 12, but I need just a little bit of background on why the Medicaid changes. Why did that occur?
Yeah, the majority, well, all of that savings in Medicaid is in the first year. It's $245 million. $205 million of that is related to the extended enhanced federal match. That's where we're getting additional federal dollars to offset the Medicaid budget. That gives us general fund savings. That's 204 or 205 million of the $245 million savings in Medicaid is related to that match. Then there are other program savings that are sort of, for lack of a better word, sort of scattered about the MCO contracts. And then there was a premium rate adjustment that we got from the federal government after the Medicaid forecast was put to bed that actually reduced costs by a couple $1 million a year as well.
Thank you.
Certainly.
Any other questions?
Madam Chair, this is Aubrey Lane. I got a direct text from one of the members regarding unemployment insurance. Is it okay for me to answer that to the group?
Yes.
Yes. The question related to what is the administration doing, and Dan alluded to the interest on that, is the deficit in the unemployment trust fund to help shield employers from getting an additional tax burden at the end of this. So as when we went into this pandemic, there was about, Dan, I think around about $1.5 billion in that trust fund over there. And we have burned through all that now to where we are borrowing money to pay unemployment benefits. The last projection I saw would be about $700 million in the hole through this year, depending on if projections were still met. Now, I know we've had some reductions, so I still don't know if that's accurate, but we will have a deficit. The way that is typically funded, if there were no other sources, was employers would then be assessed an additional tax to replenish that. Their unemployment taxes would go up for people that were working. Obviously, in the budget that was just passed and signed by the governor, approximately $210 million has been targeted to go to that unemployment trust fund and other savings, Delegate Sickles asked it earlier, to go to reduce that liability, which would reduce that need to increase taxes on employers for employees, and our interest cost if, in fact, we put more money in that. I had this conversation with Senator Warner the other day. We were hopeful that these borrowings would be converted to grants so that we would not be paid. He informed me he did not think that was very likely with the pandemic response, the stimulus coming out. So that is one area that, if you look at it, obviously paying this $210 million will help reduce that, but without other contributions to that, it will require some time in the future, and it doesn't mean immediately because they go over how long it takes to rebuild that up and what deficit they actually have. And of course, if we get more stimulus funding in that would help pay for that. But we would have to look at raising those taxes. But right now, working with the General Assembly, there's over $200 million targeted to go in to reduce that liability. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Any other questions? Not seeing any, I would like to formally thank the Governor and Secretary Lane and Director Timberlake for all you have done for this meeting. And let everyone know that copies of the budget are available for members in the bill room on the first floor of the Pocahontas Building. And even better news is they have been mailed to your offices. The budget is also available on LIS, and copies of the presentations are posted on the committee websites. And if there's no further business, we will stand adjourned.
All right, thank you, Madam Chairman.